Current time is now 7:26 p.m. here in Seoul, South Korea. It is time for Made in Korea, and joining us in the studio, as he always does, is Professor Benjamin Engel. Hello to you.
Glad to be back.
Speaking of history, I know it's been many years since you took the Did you take the SATs or the ACT?
ACT.
There you go.
From the
Midwest. There you go. That's the thing that I was saying is like one of our reporters were saying she took the SATs and the ACTs. And I said, you must not be from the East Coast. You must be from the West Coast. Either West Coast or the Midwest. And she said Ohio. East Coast, she said. And I said, East Coast? Ohio's not East Coast. Just want to make that clear here. Anyways, we've been seeing sort of a growing number of clashes between the labor unions and the current Yoon administration. And we want to kind of look into the history of labor movements because it's both a very dark, very sad history when we look at it. And when we talk about labor movements, there is a very prominent historical figure by the name of Jeon Tae-il, who often comes up when we talk about these labor issues and labor union issues. And even during last weekend, some 50,000 members of labor unions and other groups gathered in Seodaemun in downtown Seoul to protest the Yoon administration's labor policy and claiming to be inheriting the spirit of Jeon Tae-il. So again, this name is going to come out a lot. Before we talk about this very important figure in the South Korean labor movement history, can you sort of give us some context about the labor situation in South Korea in the late 1960s when Jeon Tae-il became a labor activist?
Yeah, so inevitably, laborers in different fields will enjoy or suffer through different conditions. So I'll focus here on the conditions in sweatshops that existed in the so-called Peace Market in downtown Seoul. Jeon Tae-il was a tailor, or he was manufacturing clothing. So I'll focus on that industry here. Many listeners are probably aware that South Korea's rapid economic modernization was mainly achieved through exports. To make South Korean products attractive overseas, the main focus was producing goods as cheaply as possible because at that time, South Korea wasn't the technical powerhouse it is today. So to keep prices low, especially when it comes to something like clothing, you have to keep wages low. From the company owner's perspective, the less you pay workers, the cheaper you can sell your product and still make a profit and make your products attractive overseas at a low price. So low wages were a given for laborers in these sweatshops. And one source I saw cited workers making less than $30 per a month. But low wages were just the start, really. The Peace Market here in Seoul, which is located in Dongdaemun, it still exists there today. So if you are in Seoul and around Dongdaemun, you can definitely find this. And there's a famous statue of Jeon Tae-il located right next to the Peace Market. Anyway, this Peace Market at the time was about a block-long building that was 4 stories high. Inside, there were countless sweatshops with various owners. Some of the sweatshops had ceilings less than 150 centimeters high, meaning if you were a short person, you would still have to hunch over to move around. These sweatshops were often poorly ventilated, and because of the machines and materials, a kind of toxic breathing air situation was created, and it caused many workers to fall ill. The problem was if you became too ill to work, you were unceremoniously fired without compensation rather than receiving some sort of compensation for your pain and suffering. Workers were often forced to work overtime without compensation. Statements from workers at the time often cite how they were expected to show up 30 to 60 minutes early and work 1 or 2 hours late without any sort of additional compensation. And working hours could be even longer if deadlines were approaching. Moreover, workers often had no days off other than public holidays, not even a weekend, a Sunday off. As a result of being overworked, laborers understandably at times found it difficult to stay awake on the job, and so managers often pumped the laborers full of methamphetamines to keep them awake. Sometimes this could lead to an unwanted addiction or an overdose. But a more common tactic for keeping workers awake was beatings and verbal harassment by managers. These beatings need to be understood in the context of the gender situation in the workplace. Although we're talking about a male laborer today in Jeon Tae-il, an overwhelming majority of sweatshop laborers at this time were female, with one source citing some among the workers at the Peace Market in Seoul in 1970, 90% were young females. These young females often came from rural areas to Seoul or other large cities because their families did not have enough money to educate them. So they were sent off to factories to earn money, and much of what they earned, they sent back to their family rather than keeping for themselves.
Right.
So when you think about these beatings, we often have a male manager kind of walloping on a female worker. From the wages to the working conditions to the overtime, drugs, beatings, it was just a very vicious place to be.
Might be wondering, I mean, if you're in those working conditions, why not quit, find another job? But again, you have to take into consideration back around the 1960s, Korea is not the Korea that we're seeing now. A vast number of Koreans were very much uneducated. Many of people, it was normal to find people who were elementary school graduates, which means that after graduating elementary school, they'll just go find work. A lot of people were also middle school graduates. My mom used to always say that she was one of the lucky people who actually graduated high school, never got around going to university, because even at her time, it was not normal for women to go to universities. Right. And so because there wasn't any higher learning, there's not a lot of trade, and what they're forced to do basically is find these jobs at these sweatshops, and which is why there's no other options other than to work in these very low-paying and terrible conditions in these sweatshops here, which now shows us that, I mean, Korea's really changed a lot. And this is, I think, why we need to talk about this, how much Korean working conditions have improved, and thanks to this very person, Jeon Tae-il. Let's get some background information on Jeon Tae-il. First and foremost, for many of our listeners, you know, in Korea, we all know who he is. A lot of our overseas listeners might be hearing from him for the very first time. Who was he, and how did he actually get into labor activism?
Right. So I think to start from the end, I think the most important thing to know about Jeon Tae is the reason that he's famous is because he, during a labor protest, he committed suicide by self-immolation, setting himself on fire. So he is a martyr of the labor movement, but we'll work up to that part of the story. We do know a lot about him because he avidly wrote in his diary, so we have a lot of details about his thoughts and the things that happened during his life. He was born just before the outbreak of the Korean War in September 1948, meaning that he was only 22 years old at the time of his suicide in November 1970. He was originally from the Daegu area, and his family was extremely poor. As a result, Jeon was unable to even graduate from elementary school, like you mentioned before. His father also at times worked in clothing factories, and he learned to sew from his father, which led to his eventual employment in sweatshops. But his father was also abusive, and Jeon ran away from home several times. In 1964, at the age of 16, he ran away to Seoul, and a year later, he began working in the Peace Market as a tailor. When he first became employed, he was working 14 hours a day most of the time for 50 Korean won a day. And just to put that into context, at the time, 50 Korean won could buy you a single cup of tea.
Jeez.
During his first year on the job, he witnessed a young female worker become sick with pneumonia because of the toxic air in the workshop, and she was fired shortly thereafter because she was too sick to work. Shocked at the mistreatment of young female workers, Jeon Tae-il began trying to help them when he could, which actually resulted in him being ridiculed by managers, and he was fired himself in 1966. Despite being unable to finish elementary school, Jeon dreamed of furthering his education and going to college. In 1967, he managed to scrap together a few hundred won to buy a textbook and a notebook, but that left him so broke that he didn't eat anything for the next 3 days. Unfortunately, he never did get to finish high school. In 1968, for the first time, he learned that there were labor laws in South Korea. This is how poorly educated these laborers were. They didn't even know there were laws setting standards for labor conditions, and he only learned about this at the age of 20. After he learned about it, he purchased a copy of the Labor Act that contained all the minimum labor standards for South Korea. Needless to say, most of the practices I just described were technically illegal, but the labor laws were not being enforced in any manner. After studying the labor laws, he thought of himself as a fool for not knowing about the laws in the first place, but also because rather than demanding better conditions, he had accommodated himself to the horrid work environment. He thereafter formed the Fools Association, or in Korea, Babohe, which brought together many acquaintances and friends from the Peace Market to study the labor laws, and this was his real first act of labor activism.
It's again, the reason why we're covering this figure and this particular dark part of Korean history is because it was on November 13th, 1970. So many years ago, right? This is I'm trying to do my 53 years ago on earlier this week that he basically set himself on fire, but committing self-immolation. I mean, not only does it take incredible amounts of not only courage, but perhaps also a sense of helplessness, right? That other protest activities were not really working. Again, we've talked about democracy movements, but labor union movements are now something completely new here. And so maybe not as effective as some of the other protests or demonstrations that we've seen in Korean history. Can you discuss Jeon Tae-il's labor activism leading up to his eventual suicide?
Yeah, after learning about the labor laws and forming his Fools Association, Jeon Tae-il began conducting surveys of the working conditions, trying to put together evidence. He collected dozens of statements from workers about mistreatment and violation of labor laws. In 1969, Jeon started to actively petition the government to enforce the labor laws. He frequented several government offices such as the Labor Administration, Seoul City Hall, and the local Dongdaemun district office where the Peace Market was located. However, Jeon became the subject of ridicule again, this time from government officials. They refused to investigate the charges put forth by him and his acquaintances and companions, and argued that Jeon Tae-il and the other workers should do their patriotic duty by contributing to the economic advancement of the country. They were told their suffering was temporary, and that if they continued working hard, they would soon become rich as the country's economy expanded. Frustrated that their petitions were resulting in nothing, Jeon Tae-il began providing his surveys and statements to the media, hoping that public opinion could force action to be taken. Reports at this time appeared in the media from time to time, particularly in the Gyeonghyun Shinmun. In 1970, this media attention began to provide the basis for Jeon Tae-il and his new association that he made called the Samdong Chinmukhae to enter negotiations with business owners in the peace market about improving labor conditions, providing higher wages, and shortening the working hours, as well as allowing them to form a union. However, rather than reaching a compromise with the workers, the business owners instead labeled them communists and refused to negotiate. In October 1970, Jeon Tae-il and the other labor activists working with him grew even more frustrated at the lack of change and decided instead to began holding public protests. So at first they were trying to work through the system, and when the system wouldn't recognize them or do anything to help them, that's when they began to hold protests. Following the protests, at one point the labor mission promised to reform the laws, but these turned out to be hollow promises and they never took any action. Thus, Jeon Tae-il and his associates planned another public protest for November 13th, 1970, which would turn out to be that fateful day. They wrote placards and stood in front of the Peace Market yelling slogans until their protest was broken up by the police. As the police were breaking up the protest, Jeon Tae-il stepped aside, covered himself in gasoline, went onto the street, and lit himself on fire using a lighter. After bursting into flames, Jeon ran down the street shouting slogans such as "Observe the labor laws" and perhaps most famously, "We are not machines," and before collapsing onto the ground. He ended up dying from wounds, but to add insult to injury, he did make it to the hospital. However, doctors at the hospital refused to treat him because he and his mom, who met him there, did not appear to have the money that it would cost to treat him. According to one source I saw, it would have taken a full 2 years of Jeon Tae-il's salary to pay for the treatment he needed, and the doctors weren't willing to do it for him. So I think it's fair to say that at every turn, Jeon Tae-il's protests about the poor working conditions in the peace market were rebuffed, and definitely that sense of hopelessness drove him to the desperate act. But at the still time, he was doing so in hoping of building a better future for his fellow workers.
Yeah, and I think although it was very extreme, I think there was that sort of ignited the start of the labor union movements. And it's interesting how you mentioned how when there are certain gatherings of these labor union movements, it was so easy back then to just kind of go, it was a group of communists, right? Just accuse them of being communist and so forth. And we've heard about that when it comes to democracy movements. But also, I think it's would be quite helpful to zoom out a bit and kind of look at the broader political economy in South Korea at the time. What were the relationships between maybe the government, the business side, and the labor that perhaps contributed to Jeon Tae-il feeling that his protests and labor activism were not producing any results?
Right. Jeon Tae-il was working against very powerful forces. The government under Park Chung-hee clearly understood that keeping wages low was a key element of their export-oriented economic modernization process. The government set maximum wage levels. So we talk about a minimum wage today, right? They had a maximum wage level that they urged companies to keep wages under. But in most cases, individual companies decided to make wages even lower than that maximum level. By one account, only 10% of laborers in manufacturing and mining at the end of the 1970s was earning enough to meet the government-designated minimum standard of living, and only half of laborers were making 50% of that level. So we're talking about extreme levels of poverty because of this, the wages. Another way that labor was controlled outside of, underpaying them was that the government and management intervention into labor unions. So the Korean Constitution did protect the right to collective bargaining, and union membership actually grew quite steadily in the 1970s as more and more Koreans transitioned from agriculture to labor for their livelihoods. But management was keen to select union leaders, ensuring that unions did not cause problems. And the union leaders were also often in the pockets of business of the company management, bribed or, kept happy in other ways. At the national level, the Federation of Korean Trade Unions, which was the kind of umbrella trade union that controlled nationwide industrial unions. This was controlled more or less by the Korean Central Intelligence Agency, or KCIA. Another tool of controlling the workers was propaganda. As I mentioned before, workers were told that their sacrifices and hardships were serving a greater cause, namely building South Korea into a strong and independent country. And alongside this was the anti-communist propaganda that stigmatized labor unions and urged workers to labor tirelessly lest South Korea fall to North Korea. And of course, fear was the last major component. Those brave enough to speak out on labor issues were often beaten during protests and arrested. Union leaders may be taken in by the KCIA and, at worst cases, never heard from again. Workers who did speak out could be labeled agitators, and they were not only fired from their jobs, but it would be hard to find work at other places once being labeled so. So in short, the government and business owners collaborated to keep wages low and also used fear and other methods of control to keep workers under wraps. And this allowed the government to deliver economic growth, which garnered it legacy and also made the business owners wealthy, of course.
Man, this whole thing, it was not too long ago we talked about the legacy and controversy of former President Park Chung-hee. And when we talk about Park Chung-hee, we often talk about the miracle on the Han River, right? The miraculous growth of the Korean economy. And we sort of only say that the positive things of how quickly Korea was able to grow under, the leadership of Park Chung-hee. But you forget to kind of mention the smaller people, the sacrifices, all the people that suffered. Because like you said, the textile industry was a booming industry back then. And in order to kind of make money, you had to kind of keep the labor costs low. And so we don't talk about this, right? We only talk about the miracles of, South Korea going from, dirt poor to, the major economy in the world today. But we don't talk about these people that suffered through all of this. And we kind of talked about all the things that happened in regards to this, and Jeon Tae-il kind of being that the leader in what never existed, a labor movement that never existed. But the big question now is, after he lit himself on fire and unfortunately succumbed to his injuries, did anything happen after that? I'm sure the message was quite clear on what he wanted to say in regards to his actions.
Right. So one of the most unfortunate things is that in the short run, Jeon Tae-il's sacrifice did not lead to any immediate tangible changes to the lives of the laborers in the peace market. As we talked about last month, Park Chung-hee would establish the Yushin regime 2 years after Jeon's death in 1972, and this political environment was so stifling that it made any sort of protest practically impossible. So labor movements, democracy movements, it was just really hard to get anything going. Labor found itself repressed alongside democracy activists. However, in the long run, the labor movement would not be kept down forever. In the 1970s, two parts of the democracy movement began to work more closely together, namely the students and the labor unions. Some liberal-minded university students would quit school to go work in factories with the purpose of creating a democratic consciousness among workers, and this really brought the labor unions into the democracy movement and would help achieve that final victory. But before that was achieved, unfortunately, there was more repression. After Chun Doo-hwan came to power in 1980, he continued the repression of labor that had been carried out under Park Chung-hee, and in fact, it generally became worse. The Peace Market Union that had carried on after Jeon Tae-il's death was forcefully disbanded in 1980. Laborers played a role in the victory of the movement in 1987, but the real labor movement emerged only after Roh Tae-il made the famous June 29th declaration signaling South Korea's transition to democracy. In the later half of 1987, a period called the Great Workers' Struggle emerged, and there were countless strikes at this period. And in the year after the June 29th declaration, nearly 3,000 new labor unions formed. Labor's power had increased, ironically, because of Park Chung-hee's push into heavy chemical industrialization in the 1970s. So after that, we start getting car factories, shipbuilding yards, electronics factories, Samsung. So you get more and more laborers in one place with these businesses that are so expensive. And this actually gave labor great bargaining power, because if they went on strike, the chaebols were going to start losing a lot of money because their factories wouldn't be turning any longer. To coordinate the efforts of a vast number of labor unions, the Korean Federation of Trade Unions, or KCTU, was formed in 1995. And when we hear about labor movements today, it's typically this organization that is mentioned first. And I think it is important to say that since democratization was reeled in 1987, the conditions of laborers have greatly improved. Definitely not to say that things are perfect. For example, long working hours are a big contentious issue at the moment today, but there have been lots of advancements in terms of wages or safety on the job and these types of things, which is a good thing for sure.
Yeah, and till this day, there's a lot of rift, and we talk about the yellow envelope bill, right? That's being pushed by the main opposition Democratic Party, whereas the PPP is kind of against this. And this whole thing was, again, it goes to the fact that I believe it was 2014. I think it was Sangyong Motor unionized workers. They went on strike, and Sangyong Motor basically said, "Look, you guys going on strike. This is how much we lost and so you're going to have to compensate us for the losses." And so this whole the revision to the pro, it's called a pro-labor. It's considered a pro-labor bill, right? Whereas I think right now the current ruling party and the government is basically saying that it's going to give too much power to the labor unions, and there's going to be more frequent strikes that are going to happen and so forth. And that's why when still there's been more clashes with the government and the labor unions in the past year or so than I remember in my recent memory. And every time they're going to bring up Jeon Tae-il, and it's really unfortunate that it took so many years after him setting himself on fire. But for many Koreans out there, this is a name that we still remember. And even one of our listeners, Yang Gurum, who says, wow, Jeon Tae-il really is, again, one of the most underrated historical figures.
Extremely important.
Absolutely. All right, Professor Engel, as always, thank you very much for your history lessons today. Have a safe one, and looking forward to talking to you again next Thursday.
Yep, see you next week.
You can listen to Korea Now with me, SJ Lee, by downloading the Arirang Radio application, or tune in online by visiting www.arirangradio.com. So make sure you tune in Mondays through Fridays, 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. Korea time.